So we'll start by setting positive motivation for our time, generating a broad altruistic motivation, wanting to use our time to understand more deeply the Buddha's teaching, the ways in which we can progress through the stages of the path to awakening, the method, a reliable and repeatable method left to us by the Buddha for transforming our ordinary mind into the mind of a fully awakened Buddha. So we develop a mind of confidence in those methods, and a mind wanting to secure the benefits of those methods, not for oneself alone, but in order to gain the capacity to be of perfect benefit to sentient beings. So we cultivate those minds of confidence, and bodhicitta. All right. So, as I mentioned, we begin the section on refuge, followed by the section on karma later on. So, refuge is, and these two are related. Karma is in terms of the low scope, karma would be the teachings of the Buddha that we rely on most closely in order to achieve the point of the low scope, to put an end to lower realm rebirths. But before we move on to that method, we are developing or training the mind in having confidence in the Buddha, his teachings, and the community of practitioners who have realized his teachings. So the Buddha, Dharma, and Arya Sangha as the triple gem, the sources of refuge. So in day 135, Lama Yeshe is pointing out, because we've covered in the Lamrim, we've covered how to properly relate to the spiritual guide. We've covered perfect human rebirth, and we've covered death and impermanence. And we've covered the suffering of the lower realms. So within these topics, we have come to understand the source, the conventional, source, the source of the teachings that we are able to be in relationship with is the Guru. And then we've understood that we ourselves are in possession of a perfect human rebirth, the kind of life that would allow us to make incredible progress toward our potential. And then we've understood that that opportunity is not indefinite, it is time limited, and we're moving in the direction of being separated from at least this present opportunity. And then we understand that there's a level of uncertainty that comes with that process of separation, where there's a danger that when that separation occurs, what follows is not another perfect human rebirth, but instead a rebirth in the lower realms. That's a real concern that we have to address. And what Lama Yeshe is pointing out in day 135 is that it is that potential that we possess for a succession of perfect human rebirths that causes us to seek a source of reliable, repeatable, uh, infallible teachings and inspiration that will give us the roadmap that we would subsequently use to achieve that. That the purpose of everything that the Buddha taught is to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha, to have for oneself the same insights that the Buddha had, and therefore to replicate what the Buddha did. And it is because our mind is changeable. Our mind is not one with the arising of the afflictions, that we have the capacity to engage in that process. We possess the ability to transform radically the mind that we possess now into a fully awakened consciousness. And that realization that we've looked at already, Lama Yeshe is saying, forms the basis of wanting to follow in that reliable path, that method that is left to us for cultivating that. So he talks in day 135 about the outer and the inner refuge. And we just recently did, if anyone's looking for, we're going to spend some time going through, of course, this section, but we did also have a Discovering Buddhism module recently on refuge. That's another source of material that's on the YouTube page. If you're wanting additional points of view and additional ways of understanding this topic as well. And Kodo has a piece of paper that you're muted.
I have lots of notes from refuge class.
So you can talk to Kodo if you want to understand
Oh,
the
no.
refuge class.
No, I'm going to look through them again and again and again.
Kodo's going to lead a study group for
No,
people who would like to.
I'll make tea.
So, yeah, okay. So the outer and inner refuge is what Lama Yeshe is also discussing on day 135, where initially, when we are training in refuge, our refuge is directed externally. Our refuge is directed in the historical Buddha, in the historical teachings, and then in both the historical Arya Sangha, and then to whatever extent we have access to living Sangha members. We use the word, and I think we addressed this in previous classes. The word Sangha is used in different ways in the West. Primarily now, it can be used quite colloquially to refer to people who attend a particular, kind of in the same way that Christians use the word congregation to refer to a community of practitioners attending a center or a temple. Historically, it's often used to refer to the conventional Sangha, which is a collection of monks and nuns, generally fully ordained monks and nuns. But in terms of the refuge jewel, Sangha is only referring to the Arya Sangha, persons who have a direct, non-conceptual understanding of the nature of reality. So this is not, this can be anyone, not necessarily monks or nuns, but anyone who has had that direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. They form the Arya Sangha, and the Arya Sangha is the refuge jewel. Monks and nuns are, as I said, understood to be the conventional Sangha, kind of the representation or the stand-in for the, the Arya Sangha, because historically speaking, it was understood or thought that, monks and nuns were in the best position to realize, the teachings. But I think that's not, that of course, that's never been universally always true. And I think, as people gain more leisure and opportunity and literacy increases in society and we get all of these, then of course I think that distinction in terms of being able to realize the teachings is changing. Um, of course, there's also a understanding of the importance of vows in terms of how they support one's practice. But of course, we also have access to the lay vows. So, of course, living in the lay vows is quite powerful as well, and as well as living in the Bodhisattva vows and the Vajrayana vows. So there's these different levels of vows, and they all have incredible power. And a person can take the one-day vows too. Once a person takes them from a lineage holder, then really a person, after that can take them whenever they want. So, there's that. That's quite powerful too. Um, but with respect to the outer refuge, it is something where we recognize that at the present, our understanding of the teachings is limited. Our practice is, inconsistent. And so we look toward these external sources for guidance. But then the Lama Yeshe points out that ultimately the goal is to deepen our inner wisdom by developing a more consistent practice, by gaining, hopefully ultimately gaining some realization of the Lamrim and other practices, and then growing our ability to rely on our inner wisdom, because then ultimately, of course, when we achieve enlightenment, we become part of the Buddha jewel. We become a valid source of refuge. But increasingly, between now and then, we become capable of relying on our own inner wisdom, and that's the inner refuge, is being able to have faith, have confidence in what we come to understand from the teachings. And so over time, we are able to rely on that more and more. But in the beginning, we're relying primarily on the external sources of refuge as we develop a greater and greater inner wisdom that becomes more and more reliable. So I'll pause. Any questions or thoughts so far as we move into the section on refuge? No. Okay, so then going along with this idea of in the beginning relying more so on external sources of refuge, we have Lama Zopa in day 136 kind of emphasizing that that we are right now really, of course, we've seen Lama Yeshe point out that the afflictions, the delusions, are not one with the nature of the mind. But then Lama Zopa, of course, is pointing out that conventionally speaking, for us, in a practical way right now, it is still true that they play a large role in our day-to-day experiences. That ill will and jealousy and maliciousness, you know, covetousness, attachment, all of these afflicted states are coming up for us again and again and again, really to some degree every day of our lives. Um, so he's pointing out, he says, having seen that we are suffering and that we need to find a way out of suffering, we seek that way. Using thorough investigation, we can see that we don't personally have the capacity to save ourselves from suffering. We are too deluded to find our own way out of the maze of delusions. We are blind and looking for a road to safety, not even sure what safety is. We cannot even solve the mundane problems that fill our daily life, let alone save ourselves from the suffering of the lower realms that threatens to engulf us after we die. We need help from somebody who will not let us down. So Lama Zopa is, emphasizing here that for us beginners, it's really the external sources of refuge that we are focused on, for some time, because the Buddha has already done all of the work that we are embarking on. So he is a reliable, undeceptive, infallible guide, and therefore his methods that he is leaving us are also infallible, non-deceptive, and those practitioners who deeply realized his teachings are the both historical as well as living practitioners who we can turn toward to support us on that journey. Meaning that, we do have thousands of years of great masters who have written commentaries and practices that we can rely on. And then even within the world today, there are Arya Sangha members that we can ask questions of, we can get personal guidance from, to support us along that process of practicing the path. But for us, it's really turning toward those external sources that are going to give us the capacity to save ourselves from suffering, from being able to navigate these pitfalls that we talked about, how, at the time of death, we are moving into uncertainty, that it's a karmically driven process. of rebirth. And in order to navigate that well, we need to really be engaging in methods that are reliable, infallible, and that we can be confident will help us to achieve the result that we want, rather than, because like even what Lama or Geshe Zopa, who's here, was saying, it is as if, and he was kind of in a way paraphrasing Shantideva, who says, we sentient beings want happiness. We say that we want happiness, but we run toward suffering. Geshe Zopa was talking about renunciation and how generally even practitioners are looking toward the teachings as mainly a way of getting uh, a sense of peace of mind just for the remainder of this lifetime, and not really looking at it as moving toward enlightenment, and not really giving up um, the craving and grasping that we have toward um, food and entertainment and all of the conventional things that, in a way, that we're taking refuge in, rather than taking refuge in the teachings, rather than taking refuge where um, we're experiencing um, anxiety, loneliness, etc. And then, rather than turning toward the teachings as the antidote, we turn toward a very, very temporary hit of, food and enjoyment, and as a way of just sort of putting a band-aid on it, rather than actually trying to overcome the root causes of those difficult experiences that are characterizing our life. So that's what um, he's saying. We're not even sure what safety is. Lama Zopa is saying. So that's kind of like, we want happiness, but we don't really know what methods reliably lead to it. We think that if we take refuge in our education, in our job, in our status, in our wealth, in our ability to kind of soothe ourselves through food and through entertainment, and that is happiness, that kind of, because there are momentary hits of enjoyment, and we're not convinced really that there's anything deeper that's truly possible. We, in a way, our society uh, wants us to think that is the only level of happiness that is possible, and that there's nothing deeper, there's nothing um, more significant that's open to us. And so we we kind of settle for that level of happiness, that level of uh, temporary, transitory, um, sensory enjoyment, and never really deeply investigating the subtler levels of suffering, and therefore the subtler and deeper levels of antidotes that put an end to that suffering. So he says, our search must be for a method that will take us out of all suffering, a method that will never let us down, will never cheat us, and will never mislead us in the slightest. It must be infallible. When we find such a method, then we need to really see if it can do what it promises. Then we will have complete faith in it. He says, what will save us from the lower realms? what will save us from the suffering that lies at the heart of the whole of samsara. When we analyze this well, we will see that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha can do that. We then trust in the help that they can give, rely on it, and have devotion to this way alone. Any thoughts or questions so far? Nope. So then, day 137, just like with the section on the suffering of the lower realms, Lama Zopa brought in the Mahayana approach to that concern, which was not to think only about the uncertainty that we would face at the time of death about which realm will be karmically driven to take rebirth in, but rather to also, or perhaps even primarily, think about the fact that countless sentient beings are experiencing those lower realms, irrespective of what danger oneself is in, but to think of the danger that all of the sentient beings that are not presently experiencing that are in, and the existent suffering of all of the sentient beings that are actually in those realms having those experiences, and therefore to generate great love and great compassion toward those sentient beings. Here, he also introduces the Mahayana approach to refuge, which is to go beyond looking for these methods only to save oneself from suffering, but to see these as the way in which all sentient beings can be free of suffering. Um, and so, therefore, to think of the reason that one takes refuge isn't for a narrow purpose of just being free of suffering individually, but rather to be able to have the causes and the conditions to achieve full enlightenment, and then to use that state of full enlightenment to show these methods, these reliable, infallible methods to countless other sentient beings, because not only is it effective for oneself, it is equally effective for all sentient beings. And so we want to accomplish that goal not out of a sense of self concern, but out of primarily driven by a concern for the suffering of every sentient being, and recognizing that by our achieving of full enlightenment, we become capable of protecting all sentient beings from even the slightest suffering. So here they talk in general, what they say is that the motivation for going for refuge is a combination of fear and faith. So the fear is what he's referring to as being not only a personal fear, but also fear on behalf of all sentient beings. And then that faith or that confidence is a confidence that oneself can not only be able to reach a state where oneself is free of suffering, but that oneself can actually a- achieve a state where one's own mind becomes capable of limitlessly benefiting all sentient beings. So it's a confidence that it isn't only possible to put an end to suffering for oneself, but it's actually possible to fully engage our potential for enlightenment. And therefore, once that is accomplished, to become wish fulfilling for all sentient beings and to become the Buddha jewel oneself and lead all sentient beings out of that fear that one had on behalf of all sentient beings. So then he advises us to think about those causes, um, the cause of fear and the cause of uh, faith. So, and if we don't find ourselves gravitating toward refuge, then we should strengthen our understanding of either all of the ways in which sentient beings experience suffering, or all of the ways or reasons why the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha constitute uh, reliable, infallible objects of refuge. All of the excellent qualities of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Any thoughts or questions? So day 138, Lama Yeshe now is, the quote is, "It is our own lifelong dissatisfaction that impels us to take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha." So here, what he's getting at when he talks about lifelong dissatisfaction is to really reflect on how things have been going for us in this life up until now. Because we've talked about that we've been, since the moment of our birth in this life, and of course Buddhism would suggest that we've been doing this over beginningless past lives, but we can only sort of at this point analyze within this life in terms of our memory and so on. But at least from the moment of our birth into this life, we have developed refuge in conventional things, as I mentioned, food and friends and our status, our wealth, our education, um, all of these things that we look at as being related to our ability to have access to the things that we enjoy and that we find beneficial and supportive, and to keep us from being in too much contact from the things that we find painful, the things that we find aversive. And but all of these methods that we've been employing are have not succeeded in us getting to a point where we feel a sense of deep, unending comfort and peace and satisfaction and contentment. We are in a situation due to taking refuge in these conventional things where we are feeding, we are energizing our craving and our grasping, where we think that we are putting, we are putting our faith and um, our stock, in food and so on. But what that leads to then is just these momentary, uh, temporary changes in our mood, in our sense of enjoyment, but then um, that the effectiveness reduces. The effectiveness of that is only temporary, and the effect will wear off. And then yet again, we have to go back to that. And then yet again, we have to go back to that. And we don't find that our net sense of peace and ease and contentment and joy is measurably, deeply increasing over time. Um, we feel like, um, you know, I think Venerable Yonton, likened it to kind of like drinking seawater, where we feel this sense of emptiness, this kind of neediness, and we're putting these things in. We're relating to these conventional sources, but they're actually making things worse. It's not like drinking pure nectar. It's drinking contaminated salty water where actually we are losing. We're actually we're becoming reliant and dependent on these external things. And so internally, we're kind of actually becoming more fragile, and not more resilient. And so things are actually kind of moving in the wrong direction when we emphasize these external sources of refuge. So if it was working, if everything that we had been trying up till now was effective, then we would find that our own happiness and our own sense of ease and our sense of joy, um, day by day, was improving. But really, we just sort of find that we're on a roller coaster, and that, when we get praised, when we get access to the right kind of food, when we have, you know, stress or anxiety lifted due to some temporary external, then we feel quite happy, but then when we're separated from or prevented from accessing these outlets that we've taken refuge in, or they're not available, um, then we feel quite depressed. We get, we react quite negatively. So the mind is up and down, really even throughout each single day, rather than building progressively, consistently toward a better more sustainable sense of inner peace, inner contentment. So, what Lama Yeshe is pointing out is that we can use our own direct experience to demonstrate the need for doing things differently. Einstein, I guess, was the one that said, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I don't know if that's an apocryphal quote but somebody said it. It's attributed, I think, to Einstein at least. But it's true, but that's kind of what our society is trying to convince us of. Our society is trying to convince us that we just haven't yet actually amassed enough wealth or status or access to objects of attachment or insulated ourselves enough from experiencing that which is externally thought of as aversive. But we really can also use our logic and our reasoning to look at people in our society who are millionaires and billionaires, who there isn't anything left in society in those conventional sources of refuge. And yet they are subject to the same depression. And in a way, it seems like if it happens, too soon, too quickly, too dramatically, they're even more susceptible to depression, suicidal, thoughts, addictions than are because, and to me, it kind of seems like, in a way, it's because they actually don't have the ignorance of the unreliability of those methods that we benefit from. Like, we still think, well, maybe if I did become like that, then, and we haven't, so we can't actually demonstrate to ourselves that that extreme wealth, that extreme status isn't actually protective. But the people who've achieved that, they have demonstrated it to themselves, and now they realize there's nowhere else to go but kind of down. That if they continue to try to put their faith and their confidence in those sources of refuge, they've actually seen that it doesn't work. And they have no, and that I seems to me like that realization is kind of what leads them down to that sense of depression. And because they're like, well, there isn't, there's nothing left for me. Like, where else can I go? And so in one way, we can use, to whatever degree we've accomplished those things, we can see that it is not effective. And I think we can even look at examples within society to say that we don't really need to hold out hope that there is some combination of status or wealth or reputation or adoration that will truly be protective, that will truly hold us back from suffering. Of course, we can look to some people but we are still looking from the outside. We can maybe point to some people who kind of seems like they went through their whole life with not too many, overt tragedies, but we also don't really know if that's true, because we're seeing that from the outside. But even if it is true, even if a person does that, still they've only done that for one lifetime, and then they die. And from the Buddhist perspective, they've not carried any imprints from that lifetime into the next lifetime that are in any way useful. Um, so theorize, that maybe for one lifetime you could be relatively and things, but from the Buddhist perspective, even if that could be true, it's a waste of time because you've not used that lifetime in the most constructive way to create the inner causes and conditions that will, because the likelihood of doing that again and again and again is zero. Um, and so we need to really be focused on creating those inner causes and conditions to give rise to a genuine source of protection from suffering, um, rather than just developing familiarity with relying on external conventional sources, even if, as I said, for a single lifetime, we could put together a way of using those to be reasonably protected. There's no possibility of that happening again and again and again. And so we would really just be setting ourselves up for failure in the long run, trying to put that together or rely on that in any kind of way. And that's what Lama Yeshe is talking about in this contemplation. He says that from now on, from today, we should understand that ice cream and dancing are superficial, momentary refuges, and that practicing Dharma is the everlasting refuge that leads to everlasting happiness. Dharma is the way, Buddha, the leader, and Sangha, the dear friends who take care of us, help us understand the Dharma, and energize us through their good behavior. The other ways we try to take refuge, the samsaric ways, do not fundamentally change the problem. Any thoughts or questions about any of these contemplations so far today?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Mhm. Yep.
Is there a specific methodology to use the Dharma to create inner refuge? I'm very familiar with the taking refuge and all of that, going to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But I have a panic issue where I have sometimes panic will come out of nowhere, and that's when I start chanting that to myself. But it would be really nice to have maybe a streamlined effect to get my heart to stop racing sometimes. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just something that we develop over time when we start to see that we are making the right kinds of decisions, kind of more naturally. So the inner refuge means that we can rely on our instincts. We can rely on how we, that the way that we see things becomes more reliable. We can have a greater sense of trusting that the choices that we want to make are going to lead us closer to enlightenment rather than taking us further away. So it's something that takes time, and it's really just by following the inner and um, oh, in the past,
Audio's
I
cutting out.
Yeah.
no, is it?
You cut out, Venerable. We didn't hear you.
Okay, I don't know. So I was saying, that it's over time, by following the guidance from our teachers, by putting the methods that we find in the Lamrim and other sources into practice, and then observing that we've started to make better choices, that the things that we naturally want to do, the choices that we make, that they have started to become more productive, that we sort of, before, all we wanted to do was, as Lama Yeshe says, eat ice cream and go dancing, and then as we start to want to practice, if we find that, oh, we feel like, oh, I would like to practice today, or I would like to read, I'd like to study. I, when we are in a situation where we might have acted unethically, or followed attachment, followed craving and grasping, and now we recognize or we see that our mind is naturally, spontaneously turning away from those ways of relating to things, then we can have greater and greater comfort, and that we've developed a more stable inner source of refuge. Um, in terms of specific antidotes to, the sort of specific thing that you're talking about, again, I think that it's still sort of trial and error, just like I'm describing how, we used to, and it doesn't mean that it isn't necessarily true that we give up conventional sources of refuge entirely. That's also not true. Um, but we begin to recognize that conventional sources of refuge, like for example, if a person has a migraine and they're a practitioner, this isn't suggesting that that person doesn't take medication for the migraine, but that practitioner realizes that the medication, it might be really effective in eliminating that particular migraine. However, that person is, because they are ordinary, they will be subject to illness until they put an end to being ordinary, until they achieve full enlightenment. Um, so we balance, and so, a person might, who's experiencing that migraine, might take medication, and then while they're waiting for the medication to take effect, they might engage in Tonglen meditation, where they, or they might recite some verses related to taking, thinking, oh, how wonderful it is that I'm taking on the suffering of all sentient beings, and offering them my roots of virtue, my happiness, not in a, but again, having taken the medication that's going to hopefully be effective. So it doesn't, this isn't like a sadomasochistic sort of thing where, you're only engaging in the spiritual, but you're at least bringing that experience onto the path while also doing something conventionally about it. So there could be conventional things that a person might learn from a doctor or a therapist, or someone who has expertise in the conventional sense about why the body is doing something, or why something is arising. And then simultaneously, we recognize that even if that's effective, we're still someone who's subject to that again in the future. And we will be subject to that until we no longer are appropriating samsaric aggregates. And that is baked into our experience of being an ordinary sentient being. And so, and like I said, the Mahayana way of also thinking about that is that there are countless sentient beings who are subject to that same. And so we can also use that as a way of touching the ground of suffering that we share with all sentient beings, and thinking, that I'm motivated not only to put an end to this because I experience it, but also there's countless other sentient beings experiencing it, and I need to put an end to that suffering for them as well. And so I must fully develop my mind. I must fully practice the path and achieve that result. But I don't myself know. I can't give you any personal guidance about, but maybe Kodo knows of something that she's found effective, or she wants to say something. But
Can I share what I read today in the Dalai Lama's book with Tubten children? And if you text me, I gave you my number in the chat. I'll photograph the things, but it's from this amazing book, Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature. And exactly on page 114, 115 are the list of antidotes for various things. To remedy anxiety and deluded doubt, observe the breath. Focus your attention on the gentle flow of your breath without allowing the mind to spin with fabricated, self-centered stories. And to lessen disturbing emotions in general, remember that they are not you. They are not who you are, and are not embedded in nature of your mind. That's on page 115. But if you text me, I'll photograph those for you. Hope you feel better.
Thank you. That was helpful. I'm texting you now.
all right, so we've gone a little bit past time for today, so we will leave it there unless there's any final thoughts or questions. All right, so we will end with dedication. So we recollect the altruistic motivation that we established, and think that having listened and participated in the material, the course, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind, and we offer that energy for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. Thinking, may it ripen in whatever ways truly beneficial for sentient beings. So then just take a moment and visualize all of the vast, profound ways that you would like that positive energy to ripen on behalf of all sentient beings. All right. So we will continue with refuge on Thursday. Have a good night.